Our next guest is Chris Hedges. He's an American Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, professor at Princeton University, and author of several New York Times bestsellers. He's also a Presbyterian minister. Hedges spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, West Asia, Africa, and the Balkans, and he's reported from more than 50 countries. He joins us from his home in Princeton, New Jersey. Do you think that Donald J. Trump is a success as a president, or is he a failure, or is it yet to be ascertained?
Well, he's a fraud. He was never a great business tycoon. That was a media creation on the show Apprentice. He played the role of one, but his own track record is pretty abysmal in terms of defrauding creditors, partners, investors, contractors, banks, and everyone else. So I think this is just consistent with the kind of sham persona that characterizes Trump as a human being. So the idea that he was a great deal maker or even a great businessman is not true. And of course that doesn't translate into the ability to govern. So it's all, I mean, the utter ineptitude, the lack of focus, the appalling kind of ignorance about world affairs, it's all part and parcel of this celebrity creation, this fictional persona that doesn't exist and that certainly doesn't in any way represent who Trump is.
Do you think, Chris Hedges, that the Trump phenomenon is something that'll come and go with the wind? It's something that might be put to bed within 2 years by the next election, or does he represent something more dangerous than that, in your opinion?
He's much more dangerous than that, because we have to remember that he's representative now of extreme right-wing proto-fascist reactionary force that has swept into power not only in Congress but in 34 governorships, most of the state legislatures, and they are just pushing through, as we have seen, every proposal ever formulated by the Heritage Foundation and the Koch brothers and everyone else. So, Trump is this kind of buffoonish face, but the situation in terms of the transfer of power to these kind of proto-fascist corporatists is unchecked. He's given, of course, the war industry, the fossil fuel industry, the national security state, everything they could have ever wanted. He's dismantling the EPA. And that's kind of how fascism works. It's the militarization of society, the cannibalization of the rest of society, the evisceration of rights, the attacks against those institutions that are the final arbiters of verifiable fact and truth, i.e. the courts, the press. I'm not saying that they have functioned particularly well, and the universities. Mm-hmm. So, no, it's a very dangerous moment in American history, and we can't get fooled by the idiocy of Trump. Yes, he's an idiot, but, I covered Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania. This is a person who never went beyond fourth grade in terms of an education. There's often a buffoonish quality to these figures. This is true in Yugoslavia when I covered figures like Radovan Karadzic or Franjo Tudjman. So it's a very dangerous moment in American history.
I see. You use the term proto-fascist. We've been discussing whether or not in the last couple of episodes of this program, Trump Watch, we've been discussing whether or not it is a fact or not that Donald Trump is a fascist, and we've had different definitions of fascism, whether there's a new definition we should apply to it, whether or not all the attributes that define fascism in the 20th century exist in the United States today or not. You use a new term, proto-fascist. How would you define that?
Well, it's fascism always has its own iteration and peculiarity, its own kind of national characteristic, and what we're seeing is really the ascendancy global corporatists, global corporate power, Wall Street in particular, and these global corporations, and so it has a kind of coloring that past fascisms didn't have. We've de-industrialized the society. This was not true under, for instance, the fascism in Germany or the fascism in Italy, or even Franco's kind of form of Catholicized fascism. So there are differences in the sense that in traditional fascist regimes, politics would trump economics in the sense that the political ideology would be carried out even if it was economically detrimental. Or perhaps the most egregious example of this is at the end of World War II, the use of diminishing train stock to transport Jews to the death camps rather than support the war industry. In this system, economics always trumps politics. It's always about the maximization of profit.
Because I remember reading about World War II, and they call it socialism, national socialism. They actually spent a lot of money to provide a social welfare safety net in Nazi Germany in order to win over the support of the people. Yet you have here a very different.
But remember that the way that they managed as the war progressed to essentially buy off the German public was the looting of the occupied territories, in particular in Eastern Europe, and even in the death camps themselves. Because at a place like Auschwitz, you had, a few dozen warehouses full of all sorts of things that had been confiscated from those who had been sent to the gas chambers, and that was all sent back to Germany. So there was full employment through the war industry. There was the creation of the Autobahn. There was the Volkswagen. And there was also the use of the occupied territories, including the food stocks, a kind of physical looting of occupied countries that did, until very late in the war, keep the living standards of the average German, rather comfortable, rather high. That's not true. And that is another, I think, important difference between this system and past systems.
Yeah, there seems to be they're almost determined to reduce people's standard of living, even their own supporters.
Yeah. Right. Well, that gets to the point of the fact that it's the primacy of profit over everything else, and that is a difference from perhaps traditional fascist regimes that, certainly in terms of that had things like full employment and cared perhaps more about the living standards of the working class, as well as public infrastructure projects.
Now, there's been, obviously every day I get up and turn on the news at WBAI at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, and I hear another retinue or a litany of assaults on Russia, that Russia is taking over America. Russia controlled our elections. And often I feel as chilled by the Democratic Party as I do by some of the things I hear from Trump in their constant harping that somehow another country has stolen our election, and therefore, builds up the idea that, maybe this, we have to confront this country in the future.
Yeah, well, this is it's basically matching Trump's alternative facts with alternative facts of their own. It's the Democratic form of demagoguery, the whole idea that the Russians stole the election, and it wasn't the perfidy and mendacity of the Democratic Party and neoliberalism and the betrayal of working men and women in the middle class that evoked the kind of rage, legitimate rage, that gave rise to Trump. I mean, if you really reduce this to its most basic level, what the Democrats are attempting to say is that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Hillary Clinton supporters woke up one morning and read the John Podesta emails and decided, I'm going to vote for Trump. Or if you look at that National Director Intelligence report, they watched RT, where I have a show, and they all decided to vote for the Green Party. None of it makes any sense. And the inability of the Democratic Party to confront reality is as egregious as what's happening in the White House, and very dangerous.
Yes.
And I think that I think that really what it is that you have Schumer and these, who was, of course, the bag man from Wall Street to Democratic candidates carrying the cash. You have these figures who understand that if they severed themselves from corporate money and corporate power, if they actually called for the public financing of campaigns, if they challenged Wall Street, they would become extinct. And so they are going to cling on to their perch, no matter what that means, even if it means the utter irrelevancy and, in some ways, political extinction of the Democratic Party itself.
Yeah, that seems to be where things are heading, at least what a lot of people are saying. The Democratic Party seems to be burying itself with basically because they don't really have that much to fight Trump with. And in fact, it seems that we have a situation where the country is falling into a hole where you have the Steve Bannon type of figure who was involved with Wall Street up to his neck with Goldman Sachs, and then on the other hand you have the same thing, and then in the Democratic Party, and then you also have, if there's any allegations of collusion between Russia and Trump, what about the attempts by the Democratic National Committee to destroy Bernie Sanders' campaign?
Right. Well, that's what the Podesta emails illustrated.
So how
there was an orchestrated campaign to destroy Sanders, and they did destroy Sanders, because the fact is, if Clinton didn't have all that dark money and corporate money and the infrastructure of the Democratic Party behind her, and she wasn't able to, as the Democratic Party did, lock out independent voters in many of the primaries, which of course was Sanders' base, or steal the Nevada caucus, she wouldn't have had a chance. It was a completely fixed system. I mean, the irony is that somehow the Republican system was more open as long as you had the deep pockets that Trump had.
Right. And of course, is the both sides have just as deep roots in Wall Street as the other. I mean, one we're talking about Mercer's and other.
Right. Well, they're all neoliberals. I mean, you have the neoliberal Democrats who demonize Russia and the FBI director Comey, and you have neoliberal Republicans who demonize undocumented workers and Muslims and they have a pretty long list, but it's all demonization. It's all demagoguery. It's not, nobody's actually confronting the engine of the corporate evisceration of the country that has thrown us into not only a political and economic crisis, but I would even argue kind of existential crisis.
Well, define that existential crisis.
Well, it's a crisis where those who have mouthed liberal values betrayed those values, whether that was the Clintons or Obama or the Democratic Party leadership. And people, worked for 3 decades and they're sick of being conned and lied to. And so that they have turned on this bankrupt liberal establishment, but it's an existential crisis because they have also turned on the supposed liberal democratic values that these people embody.
And that seems to be what the real problem is, what's frightened people across the country and around the world as to what's happening here in the United States, a country with nuclear weapons, in which there's a lot of tough talk between the United States and North Korea that can only be frightening to anybody who's listening to it when you look at the potential of war in that part of the world. If the United States were to, do you think that Donald Trump is a warmonger in that sense? Is he a danger as far as a fascist might be in having a cult of war and wanting to launch wars?
Well, that's clear. I mean, look at Bannon. Look at Bannon's ideology, and it is this belief that, this insane belief that somehow America will be regenerated through violence, which is part of the American myth, but it's also a deep component of fascism. And they believe in the inevitability of race war, both domestically and internationally. That's why there's a 10% increase in the military budget, $54 billion, which the Pentagon didn't even ask for. The security and surveillance apparatus, the military war machine, which has expanded in NATO, giving the war industry billions of dollars in profit.
While at the same time saying he loves Russia.
Yeah, but he has no power. You know, he's not going to be able to. He'll be brought into line. I think he already has been brought into line because the expansion of NATO up to the border of Russia is about arms markets, and there's not going to be anything. Nobody's going to get between the profits or the potential profits, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and everyone else, and that's an impossibility. Mm-hmm. So I think that much of the kind of overtures to Russia again fits into this race war because the Russians are white, if you look closely at where Bannon is coming from, where the alt-right is coming from, this is a grotesque resurgence of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. The racism isn't even coded anymore.
Well, they have a guy who works for this, who he just appointed, who wears a Hungarian fascist pin on his, Borka or something. I'm not sure. Gorka is his name, and then Miller, who's basically said many white supremacist things. Breitbart, which is openly white supremacist newspaper, widely read in white supremacist circles. So that's obviously a big part of it. Now let's talk. In the last few minutes we have here, Chris Hedges. Thank you for joining us here on WBAI Trump Watch with Paul DiRienzo. I'd like to get at what we've seen a resistance developing. There is a resistance out there. Is resistance enough, and is the resistance you've seen enough, or does it have to be a lot more before this is over?
No, the resistance is essentially one, it's been co-opted to a large extent by the Democratic Party, for instance, with the March on Washington, and people like Cory Booker and Schumer and Nancy Pelosi can't get there fast enough. And the other problem is that there's no movement. So because of the internet and electronic devices, you can create flash mobs of considerable size, but then they vanish like water vapor. And we're going to have to build movements that are going to have to obstruct the machinery of government, as they did in Standing Rock, and we saw. I mean, let's be clear what Obama did to the water protectors in Standing Rock. So, no, we're not anywhere near close to it. The Trump regime will be very, very harsh in terms of their response. We're already seeing all these proposed laws in Arizona and others that essentially criminalize any kind of dissent, that all of your property, including your home, can be taken, that you can be charged with felony convictions that will
for civil disobedience,
for 10 years.
For simple civil standing in front of a doorway or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's all going to come to pass because essentially Trump, with the continued economic stagnation and the inability to ameliorate the real, very real economic suffering of his base, he's going to scapegoat. So he'll scapegoat Muslims, undocumented workers, African Americans, Latinos, dissidents, and he will use the very, very harsh forms of control of the security and surveillance state. I mean, what we're watching now is, and we've seen it in marginal communities where people of color, in essence, live in mini-police states, where police use indiscriminate lethal force. People, the whole idea of due process and habeas corpus is a joke. Nobody gets a trial. I think it's 94% of people in the prison system never go to trial. They're forced to plea out. They're locked away for years and sometimes lifetimes. And now we're seeing that expanded with the expansion of of ICE in terms of 10,000 new agents, in terms of the Border Patrol, Homeland Security, the deputization of local, state, and local police and state police, and they're not going to stop with undocumented workers. I mean, this has created a template, whereas Hannah Arendt points out, which you never want to do, where rights are essentially privileges that can be taken away. And these kind of paramilitary forces will turn on everyone, especially as unrest becomes more widespread which I think it will, as people realize that not only things are not getting better, they're getting worse, because we've installed this massive kleptocracy. And I'm not speaking about just for Trump's family, which of course will swell their insane wealth.
It seems already be. They're in China putting a $50 million
kleptocracy of corporations that are going to as feed off of the host, feed off of the government itself. So you already have this proposal of $20 billion from the Department of Education going to for corporate, for-profit corporate chain schools and the Christian right. Everything will become privatized.
I see.
And that's so the kleptocracy, and there'll be no regulations on Wall Street, no control, no regulations on the fossil fuel industry. It'll just be a free-for-all. But the consequences of that in a relatively short period of time are quite serious. And the state will have to begin to use very harsh forms of control in order to continue that kleptocracy. But that's what we've done. We've turbocharged a kleptocracy that was already there. The money, the form of legalized bribery that characterizes the American political system. Now it's just hands off. Now it's just rolling like a freight train.
Chris Hedges, we have about a minute left. I wanted to give you an opportunity. Your latest book, tell us a little bit about it and whether people can get it somewhere and how they can get it.
Well, the latest book is Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative for Revolt. And then I did a book where David Talbot interviewed me, and he's a smart journalist, so it's a good book, but it's his book called Unspeakable, which is just kind of his questions. And but those are the last two books.
I see. Very good. And any last words in the last half minute?
Yeah, we don't have much time left.
30 seconds.
People are moving fast, and we've got to move fast, too.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us on Trump Watch, and we'll have you again sometime to keep us posted on what's going on in the Trump world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris Hedges.
And I'm Paul DiRienzo. This has been The Torch, and we'll see you again next week.